So this week, the homework was probably challenging for most people. The good news is that the homework is complete. There's no more homework. Uh, Yay! uh, it doesn't mean that you have all this extra free time. It means that you will now start to spend it towards group projects. But hopefully those are more exciting. Once you build out user authentication, you don't have to redo it every week. So that's kind of nice as well. You kind of can start to build upon yourself and get somewhere productive. Um, we're going to review some things, talk about groups, but first let's cover some great homework submissions. Um, and this week was tough because there was having to implement a lot on the front end in terms of nested routes and orders and forms. And then you also had to write a lot of tests. Um, but some top homework submissions. First one, Dung. Well done. Um, okay, there we go. Pull it up, and we'll pull up the Heroku app. Um, let's see how the tests look. Can I see that? Sweet. So we have some request tests, which is nice. It kind of looks at how the request from the client, right? The request, the server, and back, that whole process. So we're creating some events, we're hitting a path, and we're expecting some things back in the response. So a good way to kind of challenge yourself and go just beyond the minimum of the model controller view tests. Let's see. Great. So here is our website, and I've already logged in, I believe. Let me just click on an event, and we can start to get some tickets here. Great, right? So we can buy different quantities worth. Let's check out my events. I created an event, Ruby Lab. Let's see. Here we go. We can try to find some tickets for it, or we could publish it, and I must have at least a ticket type, so some validation there. So nice. And coming back to tests, so we had request tests. Let's see other type of tests. So we have see some controller tests and a lot of different controller tests, which is great. Even have some for sessions, or not. Never mind. Let's see events. So rendering the templates. That's pretty good. So good job with kind of trying out some new tests with requests. And yeah. Alrighty, next person is Kung. Good job. There you are. Way to put in the effort. Let's see, and a lot of these submissions also did optional stories as well. So being able to see like related events or an optimal minimum purchase quantity. Kung had some really good tests, which I liked. So let's pull them up in the models. So we have event and ticket type. If we'll check out event, we have tests around publishing and start dates, at least one sort of ticket type, which is good, and creating an event, creating an admin. So kind of just starting to develop more confidence with our tests, testing out different scenarios, making sure that it does what we want it to do. There's also a ticket type, and this is around minimum quantity. So good job here. So kind of writing some tests that enforce a certain minimum quantity and kind of exercising that. Also max quantity. So kind of nice job with kind of writing some full tests here towards more optional parts of the requirements. Oops. And let's check out as well the Heroku app. And again, I've already logged in. Let's see what my events are. I don't have any, so I can create a new event. And the start date is number picker. It comes up with a nice calendar widget there. So nice job with some UI. Add some admins here to kind of get some information. Let's just see if we can submit it. Great, and there is our event with a handy photo as well, and edit it and related events. So nice job on your testing coverage and with some optional features. All right, last person, Vung. Nice job. See if I can. Send it back. There we go. And good job as well with tests and specifically using factories. So using factory girl to kind of define like fixtures, so kind of objects that you want to use in a lot of different events. So, for example, we define a past event and a future event, kind of events you can call upon and test and exercise certain functionality. So, good job of using factory girl. And you have different model types, so fixtures for different sort of models, which is great. Also, a feature test. Let's see how this looks. So, a features event. So here, this is kind of just from the scenario of a user. This user would, search an event on the homepage, and it's modeled very much like a user experience, right? User would want to do something like a user story. Create a fixture with factory girl, visit it, and expect there to be certain things on the page. So nice job, kind of challenging yourself and writing a feature test as well as the other ones. And we're checking out some model specs, and we have upcoming and search and publish. So just kind of exercising different functionality when it comes to event, and again, using factory girl. You'll see here it's very quick, only one line to kind of create our fixture and then expect it in the test. So nice job all around. And let's just check out the Heroku app. This one I did not get a chance to log in already, but let's see if we can spin up the Heroku dyno and get it going. While we're waiting, anyone, what was the hardest part of the homework? What did people find hardest or most difficult? Say it again. Creating events, using all the different Rails forms, the nested resources. Do you have something, Ilene? Same thing. We'll cover nested resources as well today and kind of work on that. So yeah, great job with this application as well. Alrighty, so this week we'll be covering nested resources, JavaScript, and Ajax. I wanted to kind of recount some things from last week that we covered. So we talked a lot about RSpec. Great. So we talked a little bit about mini tests and what assertions look like, and how RSpec uses a DSL rather than like assert equal assertions. So it kind of reads a lot more like English. So you have your router tests, right, which aren't very heavy. That's because the router doesn't do a lot, but it kind of routes to certain actions. So you can ensure that if someone comes in later and modifies your code, it's not going to break an existing route. That's great. We also have controller tests, right? A controller test, you can generate them using the RSpec generator to speed that up. And again, you want to exercise that they return to 200, and just by hitting it, and that it loads the right events. In this case, so you want to create an event, hit the index, and make sure the event comes back to you. You have to use the assigns, right, which doesn't come standard, but you can install a separate gem, Rails controller test, to use that. How many people actually went ahead and installed this gem and used assigns? Did anyone? Okay, it's just a few people. So it's kind of nice because it gives you access to the instance variables that you define in your classes. So in the controller, if you define add events, you can then access that using assigns. All you need is this other gem. As well as model tests, right? So we kind of walked through last class, like test-driven development. So first we wrote the test, and then as we started to write the test, we added in the functionality until we felt comfortable that the functionality was what we wanted it to. And remember, in the Rails way, we want the models to be very heavy. We want all of the logic to end up in the models, and the controllers and the routers to be very lean and handle just parameter parsing and kind of more view-based actions. One of the reasons to do that is also it helps for testing. So if you write all of your tests around the model, you can be sure then that your functionality is going to work. It also makes it easier, as the application starts to grow in size, to route everything into the model and have the model be the focal point for a lot of that logic. And so last week with the upcoming, we kind of wrote some tests around that functionality. Hopefully a lot of that made sense. And we also covered in the lab briefly feature and request specs, right? And how those are kind of a little more general than a simple model spec or a controller, right? The request is from the point of time that the client sends a request to the server until it comes back, that whole process. Whereas a feature spec is kind of more of like a user story. So the user would want to do a certain action, like buy a ticket or search for something, right? And you can really express that and test all that with a feature spec. It gives you just more functionality to test out. A lot of them are overlapping, so sometimes you may have multiple tests that exercise the same code, and that's all right as long as both tests are useful in in their own way. If they're duplicate tests, maybe that's not as useful, but it's good to have sometimes overlapping coverage if it does exercise different user experiences or different parts of the application. There's also the gem simple coverage, which point out which lines of code you're really exercising, which lines are not getting run by tests. And so that's really important to kind of, as your application grows in size, to get an idea as to what is being tested and what's not being tested. A few things I wanted to also cover with RSpec. So let's see if we can do the require helper. So last week when I ran it, I forgot to do the require helper. And you can define it in the RSpec. Let's see if this one doesn't have it. Okay. So last week we did ticket. So if I open up the event spec, right, we have to include this require Rails helper at the top of every file. And there's a way to do that if you define an RSpec file. So if we enter into the repository, we can create what's called an RSpec file. And here it says require spec helper. And you actually can also go ahead and say require Rails helper. And that'll load Rails helper into every top of every test file. So you don't have to include it. What is the downside of including it this way, right? Why is this not the default way? So if you put it in here, it'll get loaded into every file underneath the spec folder. So every test file will get this loaded in, and there is a performance cost to loading in Rails, right? Rails is a hefty framework. If you type in Rails console, for example, you'll see that it takes a few minutes, or not a few, but it takes a few seconds for the Rails console to start. And so if you have a test that doesn't exercise Rails functionality, then you don't need to load in the Rails helper because it's just extra startup time. If you define it in every file, then you can exclude it from the files that don't test Rails functionality. But most of the time, I find that most tests are testing Rails things, so Rails models, Rails controllers, and it's almost worth it to put it in here and save that time. I believe you can also do it at runtime. So rather than find it in this RSpec, right? Normally you can say bundle exec RSpec, and that runs RSpec tests. You also, I believe, can pass in, I think it's this way, require Rails helper. And that way you don't have to define it in every file. But the syntax is something like this, and so that way, rather than having to find it in every file, you could do it this way. But you have to remember then, every time you go forward, you run the test, you want to make sure you run it this way. Otherwise, if you forget to add require Rails helper, the test may break and you may not know why. So that's just kind of one thing to consider. A nice kind of tip, I guess. One thing to think is, as you start to write more tests, maybe tests start to take more time, and there's a cost of running the test. It makes you less likely to run the test. Right now, as developers, you want to make sure the tests are as easy as to run, so that you are motivated to run them as fast as possible. So a few things to use. One is fixtures, which some people we use kind of in Lab 2. Right? We created fixtures and loaded them to DB. Another one is Factory Girl, which a few people use in the test this week. And we'll load up the gem file here. But it's a nice way to start creating fixtures. And so you can essentially, as one example showed, define things really easily and then load them into your test, and it just speeds up the runtime. You don't have to create them on every instance of a test, which that helps. One other gem which is really neat to check out is parallel tests. It's worth kind of reading up on it for those who are interested, but it runs tests in parallel, kind of using advantage of the hardware of the computer. And the advantage is that the test then runs, magnitudes faster. So if you can can run them twice in 2 different batches, then the test speeds up by a factor of 2. And there's a nice Railscast video here for those who are interested. And actually, just last week, all the Railscast videos were made free. So if those are interested, it's kind of a neat resource to check out. But you can kind of speed up your tests very quickly, especially as the tests start to get bigger and bigger. It's something that's kind of nice to use. My company uses parallel tests. We found that our tests are taking about 20 minutes to run, which is a long time if you want to figure out if your test passed or not. Right? So you'd write some code, you would commit it, you'd run your test, and then you have to wait 20 minutes and figure out if it worked. And if it didn't, you'd find the failure, fix it, another 20 minutes, and that kind of just slows down the process. So one engineer set up parallel tests, and the tests now run in about 4 minutes. So you can, do your work, commit it, maybe go to the bathroom, get a drink of water, work on something else, give a code review to someone else, and then you come back and the tests are run. So it's been very productive and useful for everyone to kind of keep themselves on track. Another cool thing. Finally, one other gem I want to highlight is RSpec API documentation. Documentation is always very tricky because it's very easy for the documentation to get out of date and no one wants to update it. But there's a way to kind of create some documentation using this gem. I haven't read too much on it, but it seems like it's not a lot of work on your end to create some documentation if you write some good tests. It also has a side benefit of encouraging you to write good tests and cover all the code so that you then have good documentation. So worth checking out as well. Maybe not so much like the context of a homework assignment. If you're working on a group project with multiple people and it's going to take a number of weeks, maybe something to consider to keep yourselves on track and have some good documentation. Great. The last thing to cover is continuous integration. The lab touched upon this briefly, but there are a number of tools to kind of help with that. So one of the most popular ones is Circle CI. Who's familiar with Circle CI? Okay. So with continuous integration, you can essentially have your tests run automatically. So whenever you, for example, push to a repository to a branch, you have all your tests run. You can configure it so that after the tests pass, they get deployed to like a sample environment in Heroku. It's all very possible. Circle CI is the most popular one because it offers a free plan, and it's cloud-based. You don't need to spin up your own server. You can create an account. It's free, and whenever you want the test to run, you can just hook it up to a GitHub repository, which is pretty good. There's also Jenkins. I don't know if anyone's familiar with Jenkins. It's open source. The downside is you have to configure it yourself. So it's very configurable. There's a lot you can do with it. You have to spin up your own server and configure and deploy it to your own server. So a lot of companies use Jenkins because they want to have a customizable testing configuration. But in the context of your own project, it's more of an investment of time up front to set up a Jenkins server. But the Jenkins is very powerful. A lot of people use it to deploy, to test, to have automated jobs that run every so often. So kind of another thing to think about when you think about your testing infrastructure, right? Being able to have tests run as quickly as smoothly as possible, so that there's fewer friction on you to get your test up and running. So great. So that was testing in a nutshell. We're not going to focus specifically on testing. We're going to talk about it much going forward, but I do encourage everyone to write tests for the group project, especially when working with multiple people. It's possible that there are a bad git merge and that you overwrite someone's code or something, and so testing is a great way to ensure that we have our functionality that's working as expected. So really kind of start looking at testing as a necessary part of the process going forward. But this week, we're going to transition more towards nested resources and Ajax. So let's go ahead and lecture 4. Great. So I believe I have it open in Sublime already. Okay. So I just here to have a very basic shell of kind of repository. There's not really any models yet, but at least it's up and running. And I installed Bootstrap and add in like a nav bar and stuff. So we'll spin up the Rails server and just make sure that we have a basic app up and running, and then we can start to add some models. So let's just go to our local host. And great. So very basic. We have a basic nav bar and welcome chat app, right? Not much going on. But let's go ahead and start to develop some models. So for this week, we are going to kind of use this example of a chat room, right? So before we had messages we send to someone, but what if we wanted to make it a little more interactive so that you send a message and the other person would very quickly start to kind of see the message and wouldn't, kind of like a dynamic system, very responsive. So we're gonna need some resources for this. Just go ahead and generate some resources. So we're gonna want like a room. You can subscribe to like a chat room, for example, and get messages. And we're gonna want a name field, right? Just the name for the room. And we'll go ahead and generate these. Oh man. It's a fancy, it's a new way of saying things. Is it destroy? Is it Oh, just Rails destroy. Yeah. There we go. All right, we'll use proper spelling. Great, and we'll just check out our migration file. Just as good habit. I forgot the name field on it, so t.string name, right? Cool, and now we'll go ahead and run the migration. Great. So when we go to the home page, we want to see just a list of all the rooms that we have. And so we want to set up our controller. So right now we have just a route. We have resources rooms, and we're routing us to the home action, to the index page. So let's go to pull up the home controller. And right now there's nothing in there, just kind of empty. So we'll go ahead and add rooms. And we refresh. Right, we haven't modified any view yet, so still works, but nothing's changed. Let's go ahead and start adding in our view. So we go to the views page, right? We have nothing there, so we just home and index, basic chat app. So we're just gonna add in something. We just say, at rooms. And for now, we'll just print out room.name. Cool. So we don't have any rooms yet. So we gotta create. We gotta create some rooms. So maybe when we get to the front page, we'll let people kind of create a room, make it very easy for them to get into the application. So we're going to use a form for, and before we would have said, we could do room, right? And we have to define room in the controller. We can just be pretty lazy with it and just define it here. So we'll create a new room, and we'll create a form for it. Great. So we have a new room, and we're going to want to create some field for it. Right, and this by now is all standard for, we've done this before with form 4. and we'll do submit, and we'll add in a class, just make it all right. Alrighty. Here you go. Thank you. Cool. And if we create a room, there's nothing to handle it, right? Expected. So we'll go ahead and open up our rooms controller, and we'll define that real quickly. Right. So we'll create room.new. Right. We've done this before, so we're saying params.require permit, and all we have is a name field. Great. So we'll refresh, create room, and we didn't have a redirect action, so there's nowhere for it to take us, right? So we want to say if room.save. Now we'll just say root path. Otherwise, we'll flash an error message, and we can use this pretty quick room dot errors dot full messages to sentence. And so here we can redirect back to, and there's actually fallback path. Has anyone checked this out before? It's kind of similar to like a back button. And so if we look up the API documentation for it, fallback route, fallback path, where'd you go documentation? Here, let's see if we pull it up. It's not defined, huh? Fallback path. I believe I'm saying that right, but maybe I have the wrong syntax. Fallback location. Oh, there it is. So you can redirect back to a fallback location. So it's kind of similar to like the back button on a browser, just the previous spot. And then you can choose like a default in case there is no like fallback path. You can say, default, take him to the post page or to the post URL or something like that. It's another kind of tool to use. So we'll just, our default, will just be the root path for now as well. Fallback location. And I have that redirect back. And that looks good. Cool. So now we have our controller action. And last thing is in our model. Oops. All right, right now there's nothing there. We just want to say let's validate name. And we'll say presence is true and uniqueness also true. Right, just a simple validation to enforce unique names. So it should be, what's the error? Validates. Great, cool. So basic. Let's see if we can create a room. Awesome. So now we have a room. So now we need to go ahead and start creating a way to get into the room and show kind of conversations in the room. So we have our rooms controller, and so far we have a create, but we need to define a show action. Right, our routes has rooms, so there's presumably right, a show route, and if we hit Rails info, we can see our routes. So we have our rooms path, and we have right here is a show, but we have no action yet for that. Let's go ahead and define that. And let's say params ID. We get the ID from the route. And finally, we're going to need a view to handle that. So it would be app views room if we don't have a folder full. So we'll create the folder. Oh, there's rooms. Rooms, and we're going to create something for the show. HTML.brb. And we're going to say, welcome to the room.
The screen turns on every time you tap on the camera.
Oh. I wonder if it's this cable. So the room.name, and like that. And we'll just display a basic. For now, we're hard coding a message. Let's see. And we'll just say for now, just message 1. And let's see what that looks like. So we have our room. Great, so here's our room. And there's just a simple message here. So we probably should redirect when we create that room. So we'll redirect to, right, and say room path. We can supply at room, right? It'll take us to the show action for that path, which is great. And cool. So we have a basic room. Now we have to start thinking about messages, right? So a message is sent, in this case, not to people. Like in that last application, we had a message, you send it to someone. In this case, we're going to send it to the room. And so that kind of suggests a relationship where the message belongs to the room, right? It's a nested resource. And we saw nested resources with the first assignments, like the post and the comments, right? So you'd have a post slash, some ID, and then slash comments. And the comments can belong to that post. So we want to create a similar kind of structure here as well. And we're going to need to go ahead and add in a resource for that. So if we take a look at our routes, right, we have resources rooms. We're going to go ahead and we're going to want to create messages as well. So we'll go ahead and generate resources for that. And that's going to be messages. And probably just needs a few things like a username and a body so we know who it's from. And then the text of the message. Great. And we'll check out our routes. And here it defined it as its own resource, right? Its own top level resource. But we agree that we want it to be a nested resource. Oops. Right? So we'll go ahead and add it in as a block. Keep switching.